When your options are limited, so are your opportunities. At Cboe, the global exchange that pioneered options trading, we offer more ways to move with the market. From VIX and SPX options to global market data solutions, Cboe helps investors diversify, manage risk, and stay ahead of whatever the market does next. Cboe. Life is better with options. Your investments could be too. There are risks associated with Cboe Company products. Review the disclosures and disclaimers at cboe.com/US_disclaimers.
The views expressed on this podcast are those of the participants, not of Reuters News.
If they have to do things that are basically unpopular, in the short term, can they get it past their own backbenchers, let alone, get re-elected at the end of it? And so that is a real binding constraint, I think, on the government.
It's perhaps comforting in its way that no matter what else is happening in the world, tariffs rising or falling, AI mania roaring or sputtering, markets up or down, Britain's chief finance minister will forever be under the gun for contemplating unpopular actions for Byzantine reasons. Rachel Reeves, the current holder of the office of the Chancellor of the Exchequer, is preparing to deliver the government's annual budget statement. She has to navigate a course between a confusing tangle of economic forecasts, fiscal rules her own ruling Labour government has made tougher for itself, and election promises to not raise corporate and income taxes. Not surprisingly, flighty investors and wealthy residents are nervously awaiting what she comes up with. How she will dodge a £20 billion gap between projections and policy, and what it all means for the UK economy, is the subject of this week's Viewsroom. Welcome to the Viewsroom, the weekly podcast from Reuters Breaking Views that dives into the knottiest topics in economics and corporate finance. I'm Jonathan Guilford. Flying solo this week as Amy Donnellan, my co-host, is in the US promoting her new book. Ever since former Prime Minister Liz Truss won a race against a rotting head of lettuce to be thrown out of office, it might seem a simple assumption that a return to political orthodoxy has calmed markets and set Britain on a stable path. That's not quite the case. With the 10-year benchmark sitting at 4.6%, UK government debt yields are the highest in the G7. The number of employees has been shrinking since late 2024, public debt is approaching 100% of GDP, and the government is trying to control a swelling budget deficit despite historically high levels of taxation. Amid it all, Reeves has weighed plans to hike key income taxes and then, according to the Financial Times, recently abandoned them. So, why is this happening? Fortunately, I have two guests sitting in the heart of the country's financial nexus to talk me through it. John Sindro is our global economics editor, and Peter Tal-Larsen is Breaking Views editor-in-chief, both in studio in Canary Wharf. Peter, John, welcome to the Viewsroom.
Thank you.
Hey, Jonathan.
All right, maybe let's start with the pressing issue before we step back as to what it all means. There's a lot of jargon around this that's a little bit confusing for anyone who isn't conversant in the argot of UK policy bandering, right? There's like a budget hole, which always sounds to me like somebody's implying like somebody lost money down the couch cushions, or there's some kind of like cooking the books going on. There's headroom and all this other stuff. I mean, in plain language, what is the situation that Reeves actually faces as she prepares to lay out the UK's fiscal policy for the year?
Well, I mean, it is confusing because it's set out in a confusing way. So basically, she has two fiscal targets. The one that we talk about the most refers to balancing day-to-day expenditure with receipts. But when we talk about the black hole or the budget hole, it doesn't actually mean how much of a shortfall there is right now. Actually, if you look at the past fiscal year, we're talking about 2.6% of GDP, a bit less than 80 billion pounds of difference between these two things, if you also account for depreciation of investments. But actually, that's not what the target is. The target is this measure 5 years from now. So at the end of the parliament or in the fiscal year ending in 2030, that's what the rule refers to. And then the question is, well, but then how do we know whether she's deviated from it or not? We know it because all of these measures that the Treasury wants to implement, they have to run them through this independent fiscal watchdog called the OBR, the Office for Budget Responsibility. They plug it into their economic models, and based on the forecast for productivity growth, forecast for demographics, and whatever you want, they come out with a figure. And they say, well, you are this close to being in current budget balance by 2030. And this is like the famous fiscal hole. It doesn't even refer to what's happening in the government coffers right now. And then On top of that, of course, because all of these projections are so uncertain and they have actually failed in the past, markets expect the chancellor to have a bit of a margin on top, which is a famous headroom. So in recent budgets, this headroom has fallen below 10 billion pounds, and thus markets think quite reasonably that it's the same as thinking that none of those projections might actually happen, and thus, the fiscal consolidation won't happen. So you have to then signal to the market that you're far above whatever the OBR says. And I think the market expectation right now is that she has to increase this headroom from 10 billion to 15. My personal view is unless she does 20, she won't get, a favorable gilt market reaction. Given that what we know is that the OBR will probably project a fiscal hole of 20 billion if everything stays the same, you have to add these 20 billion on top of the 20 billion headroom, and you get to the roughly 40 billion, some people would say 35, that she needs to make up.
Right. This just strikes me as crazy. Like, obviously, we have stuff like the CBO in the United States, right? And every country has its like independent, kind of like statistical forecasters and whatnot. And people are wary about budget windows and impacts and whatnot. But this whole thing of like the UK finance minister has to play this careful game of like how far is she within the margin of error of this like extremely error prone like forecast of the future, and like betting on whether she'll be given like the leash by markets to be able to do that. Like, when I sit in the US and what happens is just like Donald Trump does something insane every day and it just happens, like it feels kind of crazy. Like, Peter, is this like reflective of a different reality between the two countries, or is this kind of just some bizarre?
Yeah. I mean, it is. It's reflective of a couple of things. I mean, partly it's just the political system, right? I mean, you have a sort of, you basically have a parliament which decides everything, and the government is the party with the majority, and they just kind of, so they can do a lot of stuff, and they have chosen to basically concentrate the doing of stuff when it comes to taxing and spending. In basically one big set piece event every year, and then there's one in the spring which is a sort of an adjustment to that. And so you create this kind of whole circus and this drama. The budget's coming up, what's going to be in it, what isn't going to be in it, what's she going to do, and that's just kind of that's sort of the way the country is run. The more short-term issue obviously is also, you talked about Liz Truss earlier on, is everybody, every UK politician is scarred by the memory of that event. The fact that you had a new prime minister who came in, basically decided to do a budget without without waiting for the OBR to weigh in with its forecasts, and kind of, and the market freaked out. Gilt sold off, the Bank of England had to get involved, and the prime minister left office within 6 weeks. So that's the other. There is a sort of a political sense there that if you do this in a reckless way, if you don't pay attention to these things, if you don't tick these boxes, then you're going to come a cropper.
Right. And I kind of wonder about that, because like what you're talking about there, right, is sort of like the famous moron premium, right? It's this idea that the government has become so unmoored from reality that, you get this essentially tax that sits on top of bond yields, or that depresses the currency, and that makes the day-to-day operation of the government more expensive because you are doing crazy things. And I just wonder, like, how clean does that story look these days, right? Because, quote unquote, the adults are back in charge or what have you. And the UK still, as we said, has like the highest yields in the G7. There's still like, I know when I eyeball it, like, it seems like what's actually happening is like stuff just really changed a few years ago and has stayed different ever since. Like, if I'm just looking at like top line, like tax and spending figures for the UK government, for governments around the world, right? Like, is it just that we're locked in some like really weird, like just terrible sort of equilibrium state right now? Or is it that there was this thing that was crazy and there was a moron premium, and that sat on top of kind of whatever these trends were? I guess what I'm trying to figure out is like, is the moron premium real?
I think it's I don't know what Peter thinks. I think it's real to an extent, but it's mostly inflation. Like, inflation in the UK was at 4%, above 4% most of the year. It's the most recent reading is 3.6%, so it's coming down a little bit. But of course, the UK has an extremely high inflation rate relative to other G7 countries. Thus, it also has a more hawkish central bank, and this means gilt yields are higher. Bank rate is at 4%, 10-year yields are at 4.6. it's not that different. Like clearly there is a bit of a, we don't trust the government's fiscal policy, factor in it. I wouldn't deny that it is, but that there is. But you have to take into account that it's mostly about inflation, and also the government's budget relates to inflation. And we saw this in the past budget, for example. The government, decided on some measures that were not inflation friendly. For example, both street economists and the Bank of England believe that out of that 4% inflation we've had through most of the year, about 1 percentage point related to administered prices or prices that the government can control directly or affect directly. For example, when they raise national insurance contributions, they raise the cost of doing business, and thus companies pushed up prices. So they themselves have not been very aware of the impact that the budget has on what they should care about the most, which is inflation. So while they talk about we have to adhere to these rules, they often have forgotten that gilt yields are mostly about interest rates, and interest rates are mostly about inflation.
Yeah.
So when you formulate it like that, though, right, that feels like what you're saying is like, oh, there's actually a lock where the only thing that makes sense is for the government to cut spending. Like that feels like an analytic frame where
Or raise taxes.
like tax policy is just per se. But like what we're saying here, right, is like any tax that is going to raise like the price of some input, whether that's the input to the labor market
income
or whatever,
tax,
right,
income tax does not,
Mm.
which is why it was
Right.
the market's preferred. Like the markets wanted the government to break their commitment to not touch income tax for working people for several reasons. One, because it's kind of silly and it ties the government's hands behind their back, and that's not something the market wants, right? They want the government to be able to react to whatever is necessary in the future, and they also don't trust that the so-called smorgasbord of other taxes that they're trying to raise will not distort the economy. But the other reason is it's because it's deflationary, right? I don't think the UK economy is necessarily overheating at the moment. You see the unemployment rate going up, and it's not a particularly fast growing economy, but it does suffer from some supply side inflation and from some cost push inflation, and if the government adds to that, it gets worse.
Yeah, but it's also, I mean, this is really, I mean, I agree with John about the sort of the economic backdrop, but this is really a political problem, and to a certain extent a self-inflicted one. And so you're right, John, that the basically the kind of the adults are back in charge, right? We don't have people in government who are suggesting ridiculous things, but there is a big question. Well, they've tied their own hands on certain things. And then there is also a big question about their ability to actually deliver the type of things that they might want to do. And that's kind of, I think that's what really makes people nervous here is, so you've had, as John mentioned, the kind of the government is sort of committed to not raising taxes on working people. So even though actually working people, whisper it, but they actually don't pay, as a proportion of their income, they pay less tax than in a lot of developed European countries. They have so they've sort of ruled out a load of things there, which they may or may not break. Probably not. It looks like at this point. But then they've also got to consider the sort of the knock-on effects of what it is that they might do, and so. And this, I think, is where people get anxious. So we saw the big thing that happened really was that the government tried to make some fairly minor but meaningful for the people concerned changes to welfare earlier this year. And basically what happened was that there was a rebellion. So this government, which on paper has a very, very large majority, had to backtrack on that. And that was a real alarm signal, because basically people are now wondering, if they have to do things that are basically unpopular, in the short term, can they get it past their own backbenchers, let alone, get reelected at the end of it? And so that is a real binding constraint, I think, on the government. And then the other thing is, but the other thing is just the kind of the way in which they've approached this suggests a lack of confidence and a lack of sort of determination. And so we had a situation at the beginning of November where Rachel Reeves made a speech where she said, basically in a nutshell, she said, everybody's got to do their bit and there's going to be some pain and it's got to be shared. And this was widely interpreted, I think correctly at the time, as a sign that they were sort of preparing everybody for like, okay, we're going to kind of really go for it on the tax front. And I spoke to people after that in the markets and they said, well, this is good because it means that, back to John's famous headroom, It means basically they're going to take this off the table. They'll have a buffer. They won't have to they won't have their forecasts being blown off course by every little bump in the global economy, and and they'll basically be able to run the country properly again. And then, like 10 days later, we read in the FT a leak, subsequently sort of confirmed that maybe they're not going to do that, and they're going to do this smorgasbord of small measures, and they're going to and they're not actually going to raise taxes. And the people in the markets are just like, what is this? Like, what are they doing, and why are they changing their minds, and what is it that's prompted them to change their minds? So I think part of it's self-inflicted, part of it is the political reality they deal with, and part of it is just their own execution of the policies.
Right. This is what I wonder about the idea of, and why I kind of wanted to get at the whole question of like the moron premium and like, are the adults back in charge and so on? Because right now, like, does it feel like it? Like if you're like so you have like these two binding constraints, right? On the one side, you have whatever is happening in the credit market that is going to like constrain you in terms of, where government borrowing costs going to go, or like on, just like the literal sort of like economic consequences of what you're doing. Are you going to end up with like a more inflationary environment or not? Then you have the other side where employment is declining, where affordability issues are really, really paramount, kind of across the developed world. You have ministers across the G7, like all like kind of hitting these constraints in various ways, right? Like we had issues with like pensions in France and so on. Like I guess I just wonder, like, is this all peripheral fiddling around the more fundamental question of what's going wrong and what's going right? Because like it doesn't like jump out at me that there is some overarching vision for jumping the rails for the UK, like onto like some kind of fast track where, this general kind of like low growth minimum that everybody has been kind of sitting in ever since like the Great Recession, with like the slight interlude of COVID and whatnot, is actually going to fundamentally change. And, there are various other countries where you hear like, oh, we're going to have like an AI-led investment boom, or we're going to be, we're like a small open economy and we're going to like lean into that. There's going to be a manufacturing renaissance, or et cetera. I'm just like, I'm not sure what the story is in the UK. You know what I mean? Like, what am I missing?
I think that's right, and I think it's related to what Peter was just saying. I think the lack of a clear vision is the key here, right? Like one component is inflation, the other component is nobody knows where they're going, and I would argue that trying to stick to these numerical numbers to ultimately has meant that their vision is less clear, not more. Like they were selling that we know what we're doing because we're gonna hit all these OBR rules, but actually ultimately we don't know where they're going. I mean, one argument in favor of things getting better from here is that if inflation keeps going down, you've seen a lot of scaring among consumers who still have today a very high savings rate. You see this across Europe as well. If you have inflation meaningfully coming down, interest rates meaningfully coming down, house prices going up at a faster pace than they are right now, you might see a rebound in the cyclical element of growth. And this might put the government in a better position, not just fiscally, but also to claim that they're achieving something. The problem is that longer term, the UK is in a complicated position. So exports of goods, for example, after Brexit, have remained very subdued. The big advantage the UK has had is that exports of services, mostly professional services, have actually increased at a very healthy clip. But this brings us back to the UK still retains the same comparative advantages as before in these sort of, urban services. And it is not very clear how the government can rebalance the economy as they intended. I mean, what they mostly want to focus on beyond the headlines of industrial strategy is planning. They want to get this country, which is not usually very fond of building too much, to build stuff, right? So they have a bill that is being discussed in Parliament right now, that the idea of that is that you will fast track not just residential housing, but also infrastructure and this kind of thing. So there is an element of saying, well, if we manage to better connect certain urban centers, we might kickstart growth. You add that to the increase in defense spending, which is another of the UK's strong legacy industries, and maybe you'll get some long-term growth out of that. But of course, I still think it lacks ambition is the problem. Like these types of very bounded policy prescriptions that have come from the current government, they just don't I think they lack the scope that is necessary. And a clear example of this is that expensive gas prices are behind a lot of the UK's current troubles, both in terms of inflation and low growth for many industries. And yeah, I mean, this is a country where admittedly you cannot install a lot of solar panels, but there is definitely scope for the government to do a lot more when it comes to renewable energy planning and building, and also enhancing the power grid. It seems like a low-hanging fruit that the government's aware of, but I don't think we're going to see enough of that.
I mean, look, I mean, ultimately, though, I mean, I would say if we're looking for a sort of a silver lining in all of this, expectations are incredibly low, right? I mean, if Rachel Reeves actually just shows up and delivers her budget speech without, like, you know, falling over or kind of, you know, sort of and
Crying.
and there's or crying, or as she did, you know, and there's a reasonably credible sort of like plan with a bit of extra tax here and a bit less spending there, and sort of, you know, and they sort of cobble it together. Actually, people will kind of go, oh, okay, it's not too bad. So, but I look, I mean, you're right. I mean, all these fundamental questions about the economy remain. And look, and ultimately, this is a government whose vision, if there is one, is that they want growth, right? But they don't really, you know, growth is a very hard thing to achieve. You can sort of set it as an objective, but actually delivering it is difficult. And I think until they sort of solve that question about what is it that they're trying to achieve and how are they going to go about it, I think we will unfortunately be sort of stumbling from one problem to the next.
Okay, so as long as the Benny Hill theme isn't playing in the background of the budget speech, victory for Rachel Reeves. On that note, we will wrap it up. John, Peter, thank you so much for joining me on The Viewsroom.
Thanks, Jonathan.
Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in. This podcast was produced by Cheryl Pena in New York and Gregory Garner in Toronto. You can listen to a new episode of The Viewsroom every Thursday on the Reuters app or your favorite platform. And don't forget to tune in to our sister podcast, The Big View, every Tuesday, as well as the other great podcasts from the Reuters team. If you like what you heard, please follow The Viewsroom and let us know what you thought. We have a new email address where you can send us feedback, which is breakingviews-podcasts@tr.com. And check out our views on the biggest stories in business and finance every day on breakingviews.com and reuters.com.
Looking for more investing options? Meet Cboe, the exchange that pioneered options trading. With exclusive trading products like VIX and SPX options, Cboe can help you trade in any market environment. There are risks associated with Cboe company products. Review the disclosures and disclaimers at cboe.com/US_disclaimers.